Chapter 1 of Book 2 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 2, Eponine. Chapter 1. The Lark's Meadow. Marius had witnessed the unexpected termination of the ambush upon whose track he had set Javert, but Javert had no sooner quitted the building, bearing off his prisoners in 3 hackney coaches, than Marius also glided out of the house. It was only 9 o'clock in the evening. Marius betook himself to Courfeyrac. Courfeyrac was no longer the imperturbable inhabitant of the Latin Quarter. He had gone to live in the Rue de la Verrerie for political reasons. This quarter was one where, at that epoch, insurrection liked to install itself. Marius said to Courfeyrac, "I have come to sleep with you." Courfeyrac dragged a mattress off his bed, which was furnished with 2, spread it out on the floor, and said, "There." At 7 o'clock on the following morning, Marius returned to the hovel, paid the quarter's rent which he owed to Mambougon, had his books, his bed, his table, his commode, and his 2 chairs loaded on a hand cart, and went off without leaving his address, so that when Javert returned in the course of the morning, for the purpose of questioning Marius as to the events of the preceding evening, he found only Mambougon, who answered, "Moved away." Mambougon was convinced that Marius was to some extent an accomplice of the robbers who had been seized the night before. "Who would ever have said it?" she exclaimed to the portresses of the quarter. "A young man like that, who had the air of a girl." Marius had 2 reasons for this prompt change of residence. The first was, that he now had a horror of that house, where he had beheld, so close at hand, and in its most repulsive and most ferocious development, a social deformity which is, perhaps, even more terrible than the wicked rich man, the wicked poor man. The second was, that he did not wish to figure in the lawsuit which would ensue in all probability, and be brought in to testify against Thénardier. Javert thought that the young man, whose name he had forgotten, was afraid, and had fled, or perhaps had not even returned home at the time of the ambush. He made some efforts to find him, however, but without success. A month passed, then another. Marius was still with Courfeyrac. He had learned from a young licentiate in law, an habitual frequenter of the courts, that Thénardier was in close confinement. Every Monday, Marius had 5 francs handed in to the clerk's office of La Force for Thénardier. As Marius had no longer any money, he borrowed the 5 francs from Courfeyrac. It was the first time in his life that he had ever borrowed money. These periodical 5 francs were a double riddle to Courfeyrac, who lent, and to Thénardier, who received them. "To whom can they go?" thought Courfeyrac. "Whence can this come to me?" Thénardier asked himself. Moreover, Marius was heartbroken. Everything had plunged through a trap door once more. He no longer saw anything before him. His life was again buried in mystery, where he wandered fumblingly. He had for a moment beheld very close at hand, in that obscurity, the young girl whom he loved, the old man who seemed to be her father, those unknown beings, who were his only interest and his only hope in this world, and, at the very moment when he thought himself on the point of grasping them, a gust had swept all these shadows away. Not a spark of certainty and truth had been emitted even in the most terrible of collisions. No conjecture was possible. He no longer knew even the name that he thought he knew. It certainly was not Ursule. And the Lark was a nickname. And what was he to think of the old man? Was he actually in hiding from the police? The white-haired workman whom Marius had encountered in the vicinity of the Invalides recurred to his mind. It now seemed probable that the working man and Monsieur Leblanc were one and the same person. So he disguised himself? That man had his heroic and his equivocal sides. Why had he not called for help? Why had he fled? Was he, or was he not, the father of the young girl? Was he, in short, the man whom Thénardier thought that he recognized? Thénardier might have been mistaken. These formed so many insoluble problems. All this, it is true, detracted nothing from the angelic charms of the young girl of the Luxembourg. Heart-rending distress. Marius bore a passion in his heart, and night over his eyes. He was thrust onward, he was drawn, and he could not stir. All had vanished, save love. Of love itself he had lost the instincts and the sudden illuminations. Ordinarily, this flame which burns us lights us also a little, and casts some useful gleams without. But Marius no longer even heard these mute counsels of passion. He never said to himself, "What if I were to go to such a place? What if I were to try such and such a thing?" The girl whom he could no longer call Ursule was evidently somewhere. Nothing warned Marius in what direction he should seek her. His whole life was now summed up in 2 words: absolute uncertainty within an impenetrable fog. To see her once again, he still aspired to this, but he no longer expected it. To crown all, his poverty had returned. He felt that icy breath close to him, on his heels. In the midst of his torments and long before this, he had discontinued his work, and nothing is more dangerous than discontinued work. It is a habit which vanishes. A habit which is easy to get rid of, and difficult to take up again. A certain amount of dreaming is good, like a narcotic in discreet doses. It lulls to sleep the fevers of the mind at labor, which are sometimes severe, and produces in the spirit a soft and fresh vapor which corrects the over-harsh contours of pure thought, fills in gaps here and there, binds together and rounds off the angles of the ideas. But too much dreaming sinks and drowns. Woe to the brain worker who allows himself to fall entirely from thought into reverie. He thinks that he can reascend with equal ease, and he tells himself that, after all, it is the same thing. Error. Thought is the toil of the intelligence, reverie its voluptuousness. To replace thought with reverie is to confound a poison with a food. Marius had begun in that way, as the reader will remember. Passion had supervened, and had finished the work of precipitating him into chimeras without object or bottom. One no longer emerges from oneself except for the purpose of going off to dream. Idle production, tumultuous and stagnant gulf, and, in proportion as labor diminishes, needs increase. This is a law. Man, in a state of reverie, is generally prodigal and slack. The unstrung mind cannot hold life within close bounds. There is, in that mode of life, good mingled with evil, for if enervation is baleful, generosity is good and healthful, but the poor man, who is generous and noble, and who does not work, is lost. Resources are exhausted, needs crop up. Fatal declivity, down which the most honest and the firmest as well as the most feeble and most vicious are drawn, and which ends in one of 2 holds, suicide or crime. By dint of going outdoors to think, the day comes when one goes out to throw oneself in the water. Excess of reverie breeds men like Écus and Lebras. Marius was descending this declivity at a slow pace, with his eyes fixed on the girl whom he no longer saw. What we have just written seems strange, and yet it is true. The memory of an absent being kindles in the darkness of the heart. The more it has disappeared, the more it beams. The gloomy and despairing soul sees this light on its horizon, the star of the inner night. She, that was Marius' whole thought. He meditated of nothing else. He was confusedly conscious that his old coat was becoming an impossible coat, that his new coat was growing old, that his shirts were wearing out, that his hat was wearing out, that his boots were giving out, and he said to himself, if I could but see her once again before I die. One sweet idea alone was left to him, that she had loved him, and that her glance had told him so, that she did not know his name, but that she did know his soul, and that, wherever she was, however mysterious the place, she still loved him perhaps. Who knows whether she were not thinking of him as he was thinking of her? Sometimes, in those inexplicable hours, such as are experienced by every heart that loves, though he had no reasons for anything but sadness, and yet felt an obscure quiver of joy, he said to himself, "It is her thoughts that are coming to me." Then he added, "Perhaps my thoughts reach her also." This illusion, at which he shook his head a moment later, was sufficient, nevertheless, to throw beams, which at times resembled hope, into his soul. From time to time, especially at that evening hour which is the most depressing to even the dreamy, he allowed the purest, the most impersonal, the most ideal of the reveries which filled his brain to fall upon a note-book which contained nothing else. He called this writing to her. It must not be supposed that his reason was deranged. Quite the contrary. He had lost the faculty of working and of moving firmly towards any fixed goal, but he was endowed with more clear-sightedness and rectitude than ever. Marius surveyed by a calm and real, although peculiar, light, what passed before his eyes, even the most indifferent deeds and men. He pronounced a just criticism on everything with a sort of honest dejection and candid disinterestedness. His judgment, which was almost wholly disassociated from hope, held itself aloof and soared on high. In this state of mind, nothing escaped him, nothing deceived him, and every moment he was discovering the foundation of life, of humanity, and of destiny. Happy, even in the midst of anguish, is he to whom God has given a soul worthy of love and of unhappiness. He who has not viewed the things of this world and the heart of man under this double light has seen nothing and knows nothing of the true. The soul which loves and suffers is in a state of sublimity. However, day followed day, and nothing new presented itself. It merely seemed to him that the sombre space which still remained to be traversed by him was growing shorter with every instant. He thought that he already distinctly perceived the brink of the bottomless abyss. "What?" he repeated to himself. "Shall I not see her again before then?" When you have ascended the Rue Saint-Jacques, left the barrier on one side, and followed the old inner boulevard for some distance, you reach the Rue de la Sante, then the Glacière, and, a little while before arriving at the little river of the Gobelins, you come to a sort of field, which is the only spot in the long and monotonous chain of the boulevards of Paris where Idyll would be tempted to sit down. There is something indescribable there, which exhales grace, a green meadow traversed by tightly stretched lines, from which flutter rags drying in the wind, and an old market gardener's house, built in the time of Louis XIII, with its great roof oddly pierced with dormer windows, dilapidated palisades, a little water amid poplar trees, women, voices, laughter. On the horizon, the Pantheon, the pole of the deaf mutes, the Val de Grâce, black, squat, fantastic, amusing, magnificent, and, in the background, the severe square crests of the towers of Notre Dame. As the place is worth looking at, no one goes thither. Hardly one cart or wagoner passes in a quarter of an hour. It chanced that Marius' solitary strolls led him to this plot of ground near the water. That day there was a rarity on the boulevard, a passer-by. Marius, vaguely impressed with the almost savage beauty of the place, asked this passer-by, "What is the name of this spot?" The person replied, "It is the Lark's Meadow." And he added, "It was here that Ulbach killed the shepherdess of Ivry." But after the word lark, Marius heard nothing more. These sudden congealments in the state of reverie, which a single word suffices to evoke, do occur. The entire thought is abruptly condensed around an idea, and it is no longer capable of perceiving anything else. The lark was the appellation which had replaced Ursule in the depths of Marius' melancholy. "Stop," said he, with a sort of unreasoning stupor peculiar to these mysterious asides. "This is her meadow. I shall know where she lives now." It was absurd, but irresistible. And every day he returned to that meadow of the lark. End of Book 2, Chapter 1. Chapter 2 of Book 2 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 2, Eponine. Chapter 2. Embryonic formation of crimes in the incubation of prisons. Javert's triumph in the Gorbeau hovel seemed complete, but had not been so. In the first place, and this constituted the principal anxiety, Javert had not taken the prisoner. The assassinated man who flees is more suspicious than the assassin, and it is probable that this personage, who had been so precious a capture for the ruffians, would be no less fine a prize for the authorities. And then, Montparnasse had escaped Javert. Another opportunity of laying hands on that devil's dandy must be waited for. Montparnasse had, in fact, encountered Eponine as she stood on the watch under the trees of the boulevard, and had led her off, preferring to play Nemorin with the daughter rather than Schinderhannes with the father. It was well that he did so. He was free. As for Eponine, Javert had caused her to be seized, a mediocre consolation. Eponine had joined Azelma at Les Madelonettes. And finally, on the way from the Gorbeau house to La Force, one of the principal prisoners, Claquesous, had been lost. It was not known how this had been effected. The police agents and the sergeants could not understand it at all. He had converted himself into vapour. He had slipped through the handcuffs. He had trickled through the crevices of the carriage. The fiacre was cracked, and he had fled. All that they were able to say was, that on arriving at the prison, there was no Claquesous. Either the fairies or the police had had a hand in it. Had Claquesous melted into the shadows like a snowflake in water? Had there been unavowed connivance of the police agents? Did this man belong to the double enigma of order and disorder? Was he concentric with infraction and repression? Had this sphinx his forepaws in crime and his hindpaws in authority? Javert did not accept such combinations, and would have bristled up against such compromises. But his squad included other inspectors besides himself, who were more initiated than he, perhaps, although they were his subordinates in the secrets of the prefecture, and Claquesous had been such a villain that he might make a very good agent. It is an excellent thing for ruffianism and an admirable thing for the police to be on such intimate juggling terms with the night. These double-edged rascals do exist. However that may be, Claquesous had gone astray and was not found again. Javert appeared to be more irritated than amazed at this. As for Marius, that booby of a lawyer, who had probably become frightened and whose name Javert had forgotten, Javert attached very little importance to him. Moreover, a lawyer can be hunted up at any time. But was he a lawyer after all? The investigation had begun. The magistrate had thought it advisable not to put one of these men of the band of Patron Minette in close confinement, in the hope that he would chatter. This man was Brujon, the long-haired man of the Rue du Petit Banquier. He had been let loose in the Charlemagne courtyard, and the eyes of the watchers were fixed on him. This name of Brujon is one of the souvenirs of La Force. In that hideous courtyard, called the court of the Bâtiment Neuf, new building, which the administration called the Court Saint Bernard, and which the robbers called the Fossé Lion, the Lion's Ditch, on that wall covered with scales and leprosy, which rose to the left to a level with the roofs, near an old door of rusty iron, which led to the ancient chapel of the ducal residence of La Force, then turned in a dormitory for ruffians, there could still be seen, 12 years ago, a sort of fortress roughly carved in the stone with a nail, and beneath it this signature, Brujon, 1811. The Brujon of 1811 was the father of the Brujon of 1832. The latter, of whom the reader caught but a glimpse at the Gorbeau house, was a very cunning and very adroit young spark, with a bewildered and plaintive air. It was in consequence of this plaintive air that the magistrate had released him, thinking him more useful in the Charlemagne yard than in close confinement. Robbers do not interrupt their profession because they are in the hands of justice. They do not let themselves be put out by such a trifle as that. To be in prison for one crime is no reason for not beginning on another crime. They are artists, who have one picture in the salon, and who toil, none the less, on a new work in their studios. Brujon seemed to be stupefied by prison. He could sometimes be seen standing by the hour together in front of the sutler's window in the Charlemagne yard, staring like an idiot at the sordid list of prices which began with garlic, 62 centimes, and ended with cigar, 5 centimes. Or he passed his time in trembling, chattering his teeth, saying that he had a fever, and inquiring whether one of the 28 beds in the fever ward was vacant. All at once, towards the end of February 1832, it was discovered that Brujon, that somnolent fellow, had had 3 different commissions executed by the errand men of the establishment, not under his own name, but in the name of 3 of his comrades, and they had cost him in all 50 sous, an exorbitant outlay which attracted the attention of the prison corporal. Inquiries were instituted, and on consulting the tariff of commissions posted in the convicts' parlour, it was learned that the 50 sous could be analysed as follows: 3 commissions, 1 to the Pantheon, 10 sous, 1 to Val de Grace, 15 sous, and 1 to the Barrière des Grenelles, 25 sous. This last was the dearest of the whole tariff. Now at the Pantheon, at the Val de Grace, and at the Barrière des Grenelles were situated the domiciles of the 3 very redoubtable prowlers of the barriers, Daniels, alias Bizarre, Glorieux, an ex-convict, and Barricades, upon whom the attention of the police was directed by this incident. It was thought that these men were members of Patron Minette. 2 of those leaders, Babet and Guelmer, had been captured. It was supposed that the messages, which had been addressed, not to houses but to people who were waiting for them in the street, must have contained information with regard to some crime that had been plotted. They were in possession of other indications. They laid hand on the 3 prowlers, and supposed that they had circumvented some one or other of Brujon's machinations. About a week after these measures had been taken, one night, as the superintendent of the watch, who had been inspecting the lower dormitory in the Bâtiment Neuf, was about to drop his chestnut in the box, this was the means adopted to make sure that the watchmen performed their duties punctually. Every hour, a chestnut must be dropped into all the boxes nailed to the doors of the dormitories. A watchman looked through the peephole of the dormitory, and beheld Brujon sitting on his bed and writing something by the light of the hall lamp. The guardian entered. Brujon was put in a solitary cell for a month, but they were not able to seize what he had written. The police learned nothing further about it. What is certain is that on the following morning a postilion was flung from the Charlemagne yard into the Lion's Ditch, over the 5-story building which separated the 2 courtyards. What prisoners call a postilion is a pallet of bread artistically moulded, which is sent into Ireland. that is to say, over the roofs of a prison, from one courtyard to another. Etymology, over England, from one land to another, into Ireland. This little pellet falls in the yard. The man who picks it up opens it and finds in it a note addressed to some prisoner in that yard. If it is a prisoner who finds the treasure, he forwards the note to its destination. If it is a keeper, or one of the prisoners secretly sold, who are called sheep in prisons and foxes in the galleys, the note is taken to the office and handed over to the police. On this occasion, the postilion reached its address, although the person to whom it was addressed was, at that moment, in solitary confinement. This person was no other than Babet, one of the four heads of Patron Minette. The postilion contained a roll of paper on which only these two lines were written: Babet, there is an affair in the Rue Plumet, a gate on a garden. This is what Brujon had written the night before. In spite of male and female searchers, Babet managed to pass the note on from La Force to the Salpêtrière, to a good friend whom he had, and who was shut up there. This woman, in turn, transmitted the note to another woman of her acquaintance, a certain Magnon, who was strongly suspected by the police, though not yet arrested. This Magnon, whose name the reader has already seen, had relations with the Thénardiers, which will be described in detail later on, and she could, by going to see Éponine, serve as a bridge between the Salpêtrière and les Madelonettes. It happened, at precisely that moment, as proofs were wanting in the investigation directed against Thénardier in the matter of his daughters, Éponine and Azelma were released. When Éponine came out, Magnon, who was watching the gate of the Madelonettes, handed her Brujon's note to Babet, charging her to look into the matter. Éponine went to the Rue Plumet, recognized the gate and the garden, observed the house, spied, lurked, and, a few days later, brought to Magnon, who delivers in the Rue Cloche-Perce, a biscuit, which Magnon transmitted to Babet's mistress in the Salpêtrière. A biscuit, in the shady symbolism of prisons, signifies nothing to be done. So that in less than a week from that time, as Brujon and Babet met in the circle of La Force, the one on his way to the examination, the other on his way from it. Well, asked Brujon, the Rue P? Biscuit, replied Babet. Thus did the fetus of crime, engendered by Brujon in La Force, miscarry. This miscarriage had its consequences, however, which were perfectly distinct from Brujon's programme. The reader will see what they were. Often when we think we are knotting one thread, we are tying quite another. End of Book 2, Chapter 2. Chapters 3 and 4 of Book 2 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 2, Éponine. Chapter 3, Apparition to Father Mabeuf. Marius no longer went to see anyone, but he sometimes encountered Father Mabeuf by chance. While Marius was slowly descending those melancholy steps which may be called the cellar stairs, and which lead to places without light, where the happy can be heard walking overhead, Monsieur Mabeuf was descending on his side. The flora of Cauteretz no longer sold at all. The experiments on indigo had not been successful in the little garden of Austerlitz, which had a bad exposure. Monsieur Mabeuf could cultivate there only a few plants which loved shade and dampness. Nevertheless, he did not become discouraged. He had obtained a corner in the Jardin des Plantes, with a good exposure, to make his trials with indigo at his own expense. For this purpose, he had pawned his copper plates of the flora. He had reduced his breakfast to 2 eggs, and he left one of these for his old servant, to whom he had paid no wages for the last 15 months. And often his breakfast was his only meal. He no longer smiled with his infantile smile. He had grown morose and no longer received visitors. Marius did well not to dream of going thither. Sometimes, at the hour when Monsieur Mabeuf was on his way to the Jardin des Plantes, the old man and the young man passed each other on the Boulevard de l'Hôpital. They did not speak, and only exchanged a melancholy sign of the head. A heart-breaking thing it is that there comes a moment when misery looses bonds. Two men who have been friends become two chance passers-by. Royal the bookseller was dead. Monsieur Mabeuf no longer knew his books, his garden, or his indigo. These were the three forms which happiness, pleasure, and hope had assumed for him. This sufficed him for his living. He said to himself, "When I shall have made my balls of bluing, I shall be rich. I will withdraw my copperplates from the pawn-shop. I will put my Flora in vogue again with trickery, plenty of money, and advertisements in the newspapers. And I will buy, I know well where, a copy of Pierre de Médine's Art Naviguer, with woodcuts, edition of 1655. In the meantime, he toiled all day over his plot of indigo, and at night he returned home to water his garden and to read his books. At that epoch, Monsieur Mabeuf was nearly 80 years of age. One evening he had a singular apparition. He had returned home while it was still broad daylight. Mother Plutarque, whose health was declining, was ill and in bed. He had dined on a bone, on which a little meat lingered, and a bit of bread that he had found on the kitchen table, and had seated himself on an overturned stone post, which took the place of a bench in his garden. Near this bench there rose, after a fashion in orchid gardens, a sort of large chest, of beams and planks, much dilapidated, a rabbit hutch on the ground floor, a fruit closet on the first. There was nothing in the hutch, but there were a few apples in the fruit closet, the remains of the winter's provision. Monsieur Mabeuf had set himself to turning over and reading, with the aid of his glasses, two books of which he was passionately fond, and in which, a serious thing at his age, he was interested. His natural timidity rendered him accessible to the acceptance of superstitions in a certain degree. The first of these books was the famous treatise of President Delancre, De l'inconstance des démons. The other was a quarto by Moutor de la Rubaudière, Sur les diables de Vauvert et les gobelins de la Bièvre. This last mentioned old volume interested him all the more because his garden had been one of the spots haunted by goblins in former times. The twilight had begun to whiten what was on high and to blacken all below. As he read, over the top of the book which he held in his hand, Father Mabeuf was surveying his plants, and among others, a magnificent rhododendron which was one of his consolations. 4 days of heat, wind, and sun without a drop of rain had passed. The stalks were bending, the buds drooping, the leaves falling. All this needed water, the rhododendron was particularly sad. Father Mabeuf was one of those persons for whom plants have souls. The old man had toiled all day over his indigo plot, he was worn out with fatigue, but he rose, laid his books on the bench, and walked, all bent over and with tottering footsteps, to the well. But when he had grasped the chain, he could not even draw it sufficiently to unhook it. Then he turned round and cast a glance of anguish towards heaven, which was becoming studded with stars. The evening had that serenity which overwhelms the troubles of man beneath an indescribably mournful and eternal joy. The night promised to be as arid as the day had been. Stars everywhere, thought the old man, not the tiniest cloud, not a drop of water. And his head, which had been upraised for a moment, fell back upon his breast. He raised it again, and once more looked at the sky, murmuring, "A tear of dew, a little pity." He tried again to unhook the chain of the well, and could not. At that moment, he heard a voice saying, "Father Mabeuf, would you like to have me water your garden for you?" At the same time, a noise, as of a wild animal passing, became audible in the hedge, and he beheld emerging from the shrubbery a sort of tall, slender girl, who drew herself up in front of him and stared boldly at him. She had less the air of a human being than of a form which had just blossomed forth from the twilight. Before Father Mabeuf, who was easily terrified, and who was, as we have said, quick to take alarm, was able to reply by a single syllable, this being, whose movements had a sort of odd abruptness in the darkness, had unhooked the chain, plunged in and withdrawn the bucket, and filled the watering pot. And the goodman beheld this apparition, which had bare feet and a tattered petticoat, running about among the flower beds, distributing life around her. The sound of the watering pot on the leaves filled Father Mabeuf's soul with ecstasy. It seemed to him that the rhododendron was happy now. The first bucketful emptied, the girl drew a second, then a third. She watered the whole garden. There was something about her, as she thus ran about among paths, where her outline appeared perfectly black, waving her angular arms, and with her fichu all in rags, that resembled a bat. When she had finished, Father Mabeuf approached her with tears in his eyes, and laid his hand on her brow. "God will bless you," said he. "You are an angel, since you take care of the flowers." "No," she replied, "I am the devil, but that's all the same to me." The old man exclaimed, without either waiting for or hearing her response, "What a pity that I am so unhappy and so poor, and that I can do nothing for you." "You can do something," said she. "What?" "Tell me where Monsieur Marius lives." The old man did not understand. "What Monsieur Marius?" He raised his glassy eyes, and seemed to be seeking something that had vanished. "A young man who used to come here." In the meantime, Monsieur Mabeuf had searched his memory. "Ah, yes!" he exclaimed. "I know what you mean. Wait, Monsieur Marius, the Baron Marius Pontmercy, parbleu! He lives, or rather, he no longer lives. Ah, well, I don't know." As he spoke, he had bent over to train a branch of rhododendron, and he continued, "Hold, I know now. He very often passes along the boulevard, and goes in the direction of the Glacière, Rue Plumet, the meadow of the lark. Go there. It is not hard to meet him." When Monsieur Mabeuf straightened himself up, there was no longer anyone there. The girl had disappeared. He was decidedly terrified. Really, he thought, if my garden had not been watered, I should think that she was a spirit. An hour later, when he was in bed, it came back to him, and as he fell asleep, at that confused moment when thought, like that fabulous bird which changes itself into a fish in order to cross the sea, little by little assumes the form of a dream in order to traverse slumber, he said to himself in a bewildered way, "In sooth, that greatly resembles what Rubaudière narrates of the goblins. Could it have been a goblin?" Chapter 4. An apparition to Marius. Some days after this visit of a spirit to Father Mabeuf, one morning, it was on a Monday, the day when Marius borrowed the 100-sou piece from Courfeyrac for Thénardier. Marius had put this coin in his pocket, and before carrying it to the clerk's office, he had gone to take a little stroll, in the hope that this would make him work on his return. It was always thus, however. As soon as he rose, he seated himself before a book and a sheet of paper, in order to scribble some translation. His task at that epoch consisted in turning into French a celebrated quarrel between Germans, the Gans and Savigny controversy. He took Savigny, he took Gans, read 4 lines, tried to write one, could not, saw a star between him and his paper, and rose from his chair, saying, "I shall go out. That will put me in spirits." And off he went to the lark's meadow. There he beheld more than ever the star, and less than ever Savigny and Gans. He returned home, tried to take up his work again, and did not succeed. There was no means of reknotting a single one of the threads which were broken in his brain. Then he said to himself, I will not go out tomorrow, it prevents my working. And he went out every day. He lived in the Lark's meadow more than in Courfeyrac's lodgings. That was his real address, Boulevard de la Sante, at the 7th tree from the Rue Plumet. That morning he had quitted the 7th tree and had seated himself on the parapet of the river des Gobelins. A cheerful sunlight penetrated the freshly unfolded and luminous leaves. He was dreaming of her, and his meditation turning to a reproach, fell back upon himself. He reflected dolefully on his idleness, his paralysis of soul which was gaining on him, and of that night which was growing more dense every moment before him, to such a point that he no longer even saw the sun. Nevertheless, athwart this painful extrication of indistinct ideas which was not even a monologue, so feeble had action become in him, that he had no longer the force to care to despair. Athwart this melancholy absorption, sensations from without did reach him. He heard behind him, beneath him, on both banks of the river, the laundresses of the Gobelins beating their linen, and above his head the birds chattering and singing in the elm trees. On the one hand, the sound of liberty, the careless happiness of the leisure which has wings; on the other, the sound of toil. What caused him to meditate deeply and almost reflect were two cheerful sounds. All at once, in the midst of his dejected ecstasy, he heard a familiar voice saying, "Come, here he is." He raised his eyes, and recognized that wretched child who had come to him one morning, the elder of the Thénardier daughters, Éponine. He knew her name now. Strange to say, she had grown poorer and prettier, 2 steps which it had not seemed within her power to take. She had accomplished a double progress, towards the light and towards distress. She was barefooted and in rags, as on the day when she had so resolutely entered his chamber, only her rags were 2 months older now, the holes were larger, the tatters more sordid. It was the same harsh voice, the same brow dimmed and wrinkled with tan, the same free, wild, and vacillating glance. She had besides, more than formerly, in her face that indescribably terrified and lamentable something which sojourn in a prison adds to wretchedness. She had bits of straw and hay in her hair, not like Ophelia through having gone mad from the contagion of Hamlet's madness, but because she had slept in the loft of some stable. And in spite of it all, she was beautiful. What a star art thou, O youth! In the meantime, she had halted in front of Marius with a trace of joy in her livid countenance, and something which resembled a smile. She stood for several moments as though incapable of speech. "So I have met you at last," she said at length. "Father Mabeuf was right. It was on this boulevard. How I have hunted for you! If you only knew. Do you know? I have been in the jug a fortnight. They let me out. Seeing that there was nothing against me, and that, moreover, I had not reached years of discretion. I lacked 2 months of it. Oh! how I have hunted for you! These 6 weeks! So you don't live down there any more?" "No," said Marius. "Ah, I understand. Because of that affair. Those take-downs are disagreeable. You cleared out. Come now, why do you wear old hats like this? A young man like you ought to have fine clothes. Do you know, Monsieur Marius, Father Mabeuf calls you Baron Marius, I don't know what." "It isn't true that you are a baron. Barons are old fellows. They go to the Luxembourg, in front of the chateau, where there is the most sun, and they read the Quotidienne for a sou. I once carried a letter to a baron of that sort. He was over 100 years old. Say, where do you live now?" Marius made no reply. "Ah," she went on, "you have a hole in your shirt. I must sew it up for you." She resumed with an expression which gradually clouded over. "You don't seem glad to see me." Marius held his peace. She remained silent for a moment, then exclaimed:— "But if I choose, nevertheless, I could force you to look glad." "What?" demanded Marius. "What do you mean?" "Ah, you used to call me thou," she retorted. "Well, then, what dost thou mean?" She bit her lips. She seemed to hesitate, as though a prey to some sort of inward conflict. At last she appeared to come to a decision. "So much the worse, I don't care. You have a melancholy air, I want you to be pleased. Only promise me that you will smile. I want to see you smile and hear you say, 'Ah, well, that's good. Poor Mr. Marius, you know, you promised me that you would give me anything I like.' Yes, only speak." She looked Marius full in the eye and said, "I have the address." Marius turned pale. All the blood flowed back to his heart. "What address?" "The address that you asked me to get," she added as though with an effort. "The address you know very well." "Yes," stammered Marius. "Of that young lady." This word uttered, she sighed deeply. Marius sprang from the parapet on which he had been sitting, and seized her hand distractedly. "Oh! Well! Lead me thither! Tell me! Ask of me anything you wish! Where is it?" "Come with me," she responded. "I don't know the street or number very well. It is in quite the other direction from here, but I know the house well. I will take you to it." She withdrew her hand, and went on, in a tone which could have rent the heart of an observer, but which did not even graze Marius in his intoxicated and ecstatic state. "Oh, how glad you are!" A cloud swept across Marius' brow. He seized Éponine by the arm. "Swear one thing to me." "Swear?" said she. "What does that mean? Come, you want me to swear?" And she laughed. "Your father! Promise me, Éponine, swear to me that you will not give this address to your father." She turned to him with a stupefied air. "Éponine! How do you know that my name is Éponine?" "Promise what I tell you." But she did not seem to hear him. "That's nice. You have called me Éponine." Marius grasped both her arms at once. "But answer me, in the name of heaven! Pay attention to what I am saying to you. Swear to me that you will not tell your father this address that you know." "My father?" said she. "Ah, yes, my father. Be at ease. He is in close confinement. Besides, what do I care for my father?" "But you do not promise me!" exclaimed Marius. "Let go of me," she said, bursting into a laugh. "How you do shake me! Yes, yes, I promise that. I swear that to you. What is that to me? I will not tell my father the address. There, is that right? Is that it?" "Nor to anyone?" said Marius. "Nor to anyone." "Now," resumed Marius, "take me there." "Immediately?" "Immediately." "Come along. Ah, how pleased he is," said she. After a few steps she halted. "You are following me too closely, Monsieur Marius. Let me go on ahead and follow me so without seeming to do it. A nice young man like you must not be seen with a woman like me." No tongue can express all that lay in that word, woman, thus pronounced by that child. She proceeded a dozen paces and then halted once more. Marius joined her. She addressed him sideways and without turning towards him. "By the way, you know that you promised me something?" Marius fumbled in his pocket. All that he owned in the world was the 5 francs intended for Thénardier the father. He took them and laid them in Éponine's hand. She opened her fingers and let the coin fall to the ground, and gazed at him with a gloomy air. "I don't want your money," said she. End of Book 2, Chapters 3 and 4.
Chapters 1 and 2 of Book 3 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 3, The House in the Rue Plumet, Chapters 1 and 2. Chapter 1, The House with the Secret. About the middle of the last century, a Chief Justice in the Parliament of Paris, having a mistress and concealing the fact, for at that period the grand seigneurs displayed their mistresses and the bourgeois concealed them, had a little house built in the Faubourg Saint-Germain, in the deserted Rue Plumet, which is now called Rue Plumet, not far from the spot which was then designated as Combat des Animaux. This house was composed of a single storied pavilion, 2 rooms on the ground floor, 2 chambers on the first floor, a kitchen downstairs, a boudoir upstairs, an attic under the roof, the whole preceded by a garden with a large gate opening on the street. This garden was about 1.5 acres in extent. This was all that could be seen by passers-by, but behind the pavilion there was a narrow courtyard, and at the end of the courtyard a low building consisting of 2 rooms and a cellar, a sort of preparation destined to conceal a child and nurse in case of need. This building communicated in the rear by a masked door, which opened by a secret spring, with a long, narrow, paved, winding corridor open to the sky, hemmed in with 2 lofty walls, which, hidden with wonderful art, and lost, as it were, between garden enclosures and cultivated land, all of whose angles and detours it followed, ended in another door, also with a secret lock which opened 1/4 league away, almost in another quarter, in the solitary extremity of the Rue de Babylone. Through this the Chief Justice entered, so that even those who were spying on him and following him would merely have observed that the justice betook himself every day in a mysterious way somewhere, and would never have suspected that to go to the Rue de Babylone was to go to the Rue Plumet. Thanks to clever purchases of land, the magistrate had been able to make a secret, sewer-like passage on his own property, and consequently without interference. Later on, he had sold in little parcels, for gardens and market gardens, the lots of ground adjoining the corridor, and the proprietors of these lots on both sides thought they had a party wall before their eyes, and did not even suspect the long paved ribbon winding between 2 walls amid their flower beds and their orchards. Only the birds beheld this curiosity. It is probable that the linnets and tomtits of the last century gossiped a great deal about the Chief Justice. The pavilion, built of stone in the taste of Mansard, wainscoted and furnished in the Watteau style, rocaille on the inside, old-fashioned on the outside, walled in with a triple hedge of flowers, had something discreet, coquettish, and solemn about it, as befits the caprice of love and magistracy. This house and corridor, which have now disappeared, were in existence 15 years ago. In '93 a coppersmith had purchased the house with the idea of demolishing it, but had not been able to pay the price. The nation made him bankrupt, so that it was the house which demolished the coppersmith. After that, the house remained uninhabited, and fell slowly to ruin, as does every dwelling to which the presence of man does not communicate life. It had remained fitted with its old furniture, was always for sale or to let, and the 10 or a dozen people who passed through the Rue Plumet were warned of the fact by a yellow and illegible bit of writing which had hung on the garden wall since 1819. Towards the end of the Restoration, these same passers-by might have noticed that the bill had disappeared, and that even the shutters on the first floor were open. The house was occupied, in fact. The windows had short curtains, a sign that there was a woman about. In the month of October, 1829, a man of a certain age had presented himself and had hired the house just as it stood, including, of course, the back building and the lane which ended in the Rue de Babylone. He had had the secret openings of the 2 doors to this passage repaired. The house, as we have just mentioned, was still very nearly furnished with the justice's old fitting. The new tenant had ordered some repairs, had added what was lacking here and there, had replaced the paving stones in the yard, bricks in the floors, steps in the stairs, missing bits in the inlaid floors and the glass in the lattice windows, and had finally installed himself there with a young girl and an elderly maidservant, without commotion, rather like a person who was slipping in than like a man who was entering his own house. The neighbours did not gossip about him, for the reason that there were no neighbours. This unobtrusive tenant was Jean Valjean. The young girl was Cosette. The servant was a woman named Toussaint, whom Jean Valjean had saved from the hospital and from wretchedness, and who was elderly, a stammerer, and from the provinces, three qualities which had decided Jean Valjean to take her with him. He had hired the house under the name of M. Fauchelevent, independent gentleman. In all that has been related heretofore, the reader has doubtless been no less prompt than Thénardier to recognize Jean Valjean. Why had Jean Valjean quitted the convent of the Petit Picpus? What had happened? Nothing had happened. It will be remembered that Jean Valjean was happy in the convent, so happy that his conscience finally took the alarm. He saw Cosette every day, he felt paternity spring up and develop within him more and more. He brooded over the soul of that child. He said to himself that she was his, that nothing could take her from him, that this would last indefinitely, that she would certainly become a nun, being thereto gently incited every day, that thus the convent was henceforth the universe for her as it was for him, that he should grow old there, and that she should grow up there, that she would grow old there, and that he should die there. That, in short, delightful hope, no separation was possible. On reflecting upon this, he fell into perplexity. He interrogated himself. He asked himself if all that happiness were really his, if it were not composed of the happiness of another, of the happiness of that child which he, an old man, was confiscating and stealing, if that were not theft. He said to himself that this child had a right to know life before renouncing it, that to deprive her in advance, and in some sort without consulting her, of all joys, under the pretext of saving her from all trials, to take advantage of her ignorance of her isolation, in order to make an artificial vocation germinate in her, was to rob a human being of its nature and to lie to God. And who knows if when she came to be aware of all this some day, and found herself a nun to her sorrow, Cosette would not come to hate him? A last, almost selfish thought, and less heroic than the rest, but which was intolerable to him. He resolved to quit the convent. He resolved on this. He recognized with anguish the fact that it was necessary. As for objections, there were none. 5 years' sojourn between these four walls of disappearance had necessarily destroyed or dispersed the elements of fear. He could return tranquilly among men. He had grown old, and all had undergone a change. Who would recognize him now? And then, to face the worst, there was danger only for himself, and he had no right to condemn Cosette to the cloister for the reason that he had been condemned to the galleys. Besides, what is danger in comparison with the right? Finally, nothing prevented his being prudent and taking his precautions. As for Cosette's education, it was almost finished and complete. His determination once taken, he waited an opportunity. It was not long in presenting itself. Old Fauchelevent died. Jean Valjean demanded an audience with the revered prioress, and told her that having come into a little inheritance at the death of his brother, which permitted him henceforth to live without working, he should leave the service of the convent and take his daughter with him, but that, as it was not just that Cosette, since she had not taken the vows, should have received her education gratuitously, he humbly begged the reverend prioress to see fit that he should offer to the community, as indemnity for the 5 years which Cosette had spent there, the sum of 5,000 francs. It was thus that Jean Valjean quitted the convent of the Perpetual Adoration. On leaving the convent, he took into his own arms the little valise, the key to which he still wore on his person, and would permit no porter to touch it. This puzzled Cosette, because of the odour of embalming which proceeded from it. Let us state at once that this trunk never quitted him more. He always had it in his chamber. It was the first and only thing sometimes that he carried off in his moving when he moved about. Cosette laughed at it and called this valise his inseparable, saying, "I am jealous of it." Nevertheless, Jean Valjean did not reappear in the open air without profound anxiety. He discovered the house in the Rue Plumet and hid himself from sight there. Henceforth he was in the possession of the name Ultime Fauchelevent. At the same time he hired 2 other apartments in Paris, in order that he might attract less attention than if he were to remain always in the same quarter, and so that he could, at need, take himself off at the slightest disquietude which should assail him, and, in short, so that he might not again be caught unprovided, as on the night when he had so miraculously escaped from Javert. These 2 apartments were very pitiable, poor in appearance, and in 2 quarters which were far remote from each other, the one in the Rue de l'Ouest, the other in the Rue de l'Homme Armé. He went from time to time, now to the Rue de l'Homme Armé, now to the Rue de l'Ouest, to pass a month or 6 weeks, without taking Toussaint. He had himself served by the porters, and gave himself out as a gentleman from the suburbs, living on his funds, and having a little temporary resting place in town. This lofty virtue had 3 domiciles in Paris for the sake of escaping from the police. Chapter 2. Jean Valjean as a National Guard. However, properly speaking, he lived in the Rue Plumet, and he had arranged his existence there in the following fashion. Cosette and the servant occupied the pavilion. She had the big sleeping room with the painted pier glasses, the boudoir with the gilded fillets, the justice's drawing room furnished with tapestries and vast armchairs. She had the garden. Jean Valjean had a canopy bed of antique damask in 3 colours and a beautiful Persian rug purchased in the Rue de Figuier-Saint-Paul, at Mother Gaucher's, put into Cosette's chamber, and in order to redeem the severity of these magnificent old things, he had amalgamated with this bric-a-brac all the gay and graceful little pieces of furniture suitable to young girls, an étagère, a bookcase filled with gilt-edged books, an inkstand, a blotting book, paper, a work table encrusted with mother of pearl, a silver gilt dressing case, a toilet service in Japanese porcelain. Long damask curtains with a red foundation and 3 colours, like those on the bed, hung at the windows of the first floor. On the ground floor the curtains were of tapestry. All winter long Cosette's little house was heated from top to bottom. Jean Valjean inhabited the sort of porter's lodge which was situated at the end of the back courtyard, with a mattress on a folding bed, a white wood table, 2 straw chairs, an earthenware water jug, a few old volumes on a shelf, his beloved valise in one corner, and never any fire. He dined with Cosette, and he had a loaf of black bread on the table for his own use. When Toussaint came, he had said to her, "It is a young lady who is mistress of this house." "And you, monsieur?" Toussaint replied in amazement. "I am a much better thing than a master. I am the father." Cosette had been taught housekeeping in the convent, and she regulated their expenditure, which was very modest. Every day Jean Valjean put his arm through Cosette's and took her for a walk. He led her to the Luxembourg, to the least frequented walk, and every Sunday he took her to mass at Saint-Jacques-de-Haut-Pas, because that was a long way off. As it was a very poor quarter, he bestowed alms largely there, and the poor people surrounded him in church, which had drawn upon him Thénardier's epistle, "To the benevolent gentlemen of the church of Saint-Jacques-de-Haut-Pas." He was fond of taking Cosette to visit the poor and the sick. No stranger ever entered the house in the Rue Plumet. Toussaint brought their provisions, and Jean Valjean went himself for water to a fountain near by on the boulevard. Their wood and wine were put into a half-subterranean hollow lined with rockwork, which lay near the Rue de Babylone, and which had formerly served the chief justice as a grotto, for at the epoch of follies and little houses, no love was without a grotto. In the door opening on the Rue de Babylone there was a box destined for the reception of letters and papers. Only, as the three inhabitants of the pavilion in the Rue Plumet received neither papers nor letters, the entire usefulness of that box, formerly the go-between of a love affair and the confidant of a love-lorn lawyer, was now limited to the tax collector's notices and the summons of the guard, for M. Fauchelevent, independent gentleman, belonged to the National Guard. He had not been able to escape through the fine meshes of the census of 1831. The municipal information collected at the time had even reached the convent of the Petit Picpus, a sort of impenetrable and holy cloud, whence Jean Valjean had emerged in venerable guise and consequently worthy of mounting guard in the eyes of the town hall. 3 or 4 times a year Jean Valjean donned his uniform and mounted guard. He did this willingly, however. It was a correct disguise which mixed him with everyone and yet left him solitary. Jean Valjean had just attained his 60th birthday, the age of legal exemption. But he did not appear to be over 50. Moreover, he had no desire to escape his sergeant major, nor to quibble with the Comte de la Balle. He possessed no civil status, he was concealing his name, he was concealing his identity, so he concealed his age, he concealed everything, and, as we have just said, he willingly did his duty as a National Guard. The sum of his ambition lay in resembling any other man who paid his taxes. This man had for his ideal within the angel, without the bourgeois. Let us note one detail, however. When Jean Valjean went out with Cosette, he dressed as the reader has already seen, and had the air of a retired officer. When he went out alone, which was generally at night, he was always dressed in a working man's trousers and blouse, and wore a cap which concealed his face. Was this precaution or humility? Both. Cosette was accustomed to the enigmatical side of her destiny, and hardly noticed her father's peculiarities. As for Toussaint, she venerated Jean Valjean, and thought everything he did right. One day her butcher, who had caught a glimpse of Jean Valjean, said to her, "That's a queer fish." She replied, "He's a saint." Neither Jean Valjean, nor Cosette, nor Toussaint ever entered or emerged except by the door on the Rue de Babylone. Unless seen through the garden gate, it would have been difficult to guess that they lived in the Rue Plumet. That gate was always closed. Jean Valjean had left the garden uncultivated, in order not to attract attention. In this, possibly, he made a mistake. End of Book 3, Chapters 1 and 2. Chapters 3 and 4 of Book 3 of Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4, by Victor Hugo. Translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 3, The House in the Rue Plumet, Chapters 3 and 4. Chapter 3, Foliis ac Frondibus. The garden thus left to itself for more than half a century had become extraordinary and charming. The passers-by of 40 years ago halted to gaze at it, without a suspicion of the secrets which it hid in its fresh and verdant depths. More than one dreamer of that epoch often allowed his thoughts and his eyes to penetrate indiscreetly between the bars of that ancient padlocked gate, twisted, tottering, fastened to 2 green and moss-covered pillars, and oddly crowned with a pediment of undecipherable arabesque. There was a stone bench in one corner, 1 or 2 mouldy statues, several lattices which had lost their nails with time were rotting on the wall, and there were no walks nor turf, but there was enough grass everywhere. Gardening had taken its departure and nature had returned. Weeds abounded, which was a great piece of luck for a poor corner of land. The festival of gillyflowers was something splendid. Nothing in this garden obstructed the sacred effort of things towards life. Venerable growth reigned there among them. The trees had bent over towards the nettles, the plant had sprung upward, the branch had inclined, that which crawls on the earth had gone in search of that which expands in the air, that which floats on the wind had bent over towards that which trails in the moss. Trunks, boughs, leaves, fibres, clusters, tendrils, shoots, spines, thorns, had mingled, crossed, married, confounded themselves in each other. Vegetation in a deep and close embrace had celebrated and accomplished there, under the well-pleased eye of the Creator, in that enclosure 300 feet square, the holy mystery of fraternity, symbol of the human fraternity. This garden was no longer a garden, it was a colossal thicket, that is to say, something as impenetrable as a forest, as peopled as a city, quivering like a nest, sombre like a cathedral, fragrant like a bouquet, solitary as a tomb, living as a throng. In Floreal this enormous thicket, free behind its gate and within its four walls, entered upon the secret labour of germination, quivered in the rising sun, almost like an animal which drinks in the breaths of cosmic love, and which feels the sap of April rising and boiling in its veins, and shakes to the wind its enormous wonderful green locks, sprinkled on the damp earth, on the defaced statues, on the crumbling steps of the pavilion, and even on the pavement of the deserted street, flowers like stars, dew like pearls, fecundity, beauty, life, joy, perfumes. At midday 1,000 white butterflies took refuge there, and it was a divine spectacle to see that living summer snow whirling about there in flakes amid the shade. There, in those gay shadows of verdure, a throng of innocent voices spoke sweetly to the soul, and what the twittering forgot to say, the humming completed. In the evening a dreamy vapour exhaled from the garden and enveloped it. A shroud of mist, a calm and celestial sadness covered it. The intoxicating perfume of the honeysuckles and the convolvulus poured out from every part of it, like an exquisite and subtle poison. The last appeals of the woodpeckers and the wagtails were audible as they dozed among the branches. One felt the sacred intimacy of the birds and the trees. By day the wings rejoice the leaves, by night the leaves protect the wings. In winter the thicket was black, dripping, bristling, shivering, and allowed some glimpse of the house. Instead of flowers on the branches and dew in the flowers, the long silvery tracks of the snails were visible on the cold thick carpet of yellow leaves, but in any fashion, under any aspect at all seasons, spring, winter, summer, autumn, this tiny enclosure breathed forth melancholy, contemplation, solitude, liberty, the absence of man, the presence of God. And the rusty old gate had the air of saying, "This garden belongs to me." It was of no avail that the pavements of Paris were there on every side, the classic and splendid hotels of the Rue de Varenne a couple of paces away, the dome of the Invalides close at hand, the Chamber of Deputies not far off, the carriages of the Rue de Bourgogne and the Rue de Saint-Dominique rumbled luxuriously in vain in the vicinity, in vain did the yellow, brown, white and red omnibuses cross each other's course at the neighbouring crossroads. The Rue Plumet was the desert, and the death of the former proprietors, the revolution which had passed over it, the crumbling away of ancient fortunes, absence, forgetfulness, 40 years of abandonment and widowhood, had sufficed to restore to this privileged spot ferns, mulleins, hemlock, yarrow, tall weeds, great crimped plants with large leaves of pale green cloth, lizards, beetles, uneasy and rapid insects, to cause to spring forth from the depths of the earth and to reappear between those four walls a certain indescribable and savage grandeur, and for nature, which disconcerts the petty arrangements of man, and which sheds herself always thoroughly where she diffuses herself at all, in the ant as well as in the eagle, to blossom out in a petty Parisian garden with as much rude force and majesty as in a virgin forest of the New World. Nothing is small, in fact. Anyone who is subject to the profound and penetrating influence of nature knows this. Although no absolute satisfaction is given to philosophy, either to circumscribe the cause or to limit the effect, the contemplator falls into those unfathomable ecstasies caused by these decompositions of force terminating in unity. Everything toils at everything. Algebra is applied to the cloud. The radiation of the star profits the rose. No thinker would venture to affirm that the perfume of the hawthorn is useless to the constellations. Who, then, can calculate the course of a molecule? How do we know that the creation of worlds is not determined by the fall of grains of sand? Who knows the reciprocal ebb and flow of the infinitely great and the infinitely little, the reverberations of causes in the precipices of being and the avalanches of creation? The tiniest worm is of importance. The great is little, the little is great. Everything is balanced in necessity. Alarming vision for the mind. There are wonderful relations between beings and things. In that inexhaustible whole, from the sun to the grub, nothing despises the other. All have need of each other. The light does not bear away terrestrial perfumes into the azure depths without knowing what it is doing. The night distributes stellar essences to the sleeping flowers. All birds that fly have round their leg the thread of the infinite. Germination is complicated with the bursting forth of a meteor and with the peck of a swallow cracking its egg, and it places on one level the birth of an earthworm and the advent of Socrates. Where the telescope ends, the microscope begins. Which of the two possesses the larger field of vision? Choose. A bit of mould is a pleiad of flowers, a nebula is an anthill of stars. The same promiscuousness, and yet more unprecedented, exists between the things of the intelligence and the facts of substance. Elements and principles mingle, combine, wed, multiply with each other, to such a point that the material and the moral world are brought eventually to the same clearness. The phenomenon is perpetually returning upon itself. In the vast cosmic exchanges the universal life goes and comes in unknown quantities, rolling entirely in invisible mystery over fluvia, employing everything, not losing a single dream, not a single slumber, sowing an animalcule here, crumbling to bits a planet there, oscillating and winding, making of light a force and of thought an element, disseminated and invisible, dissolving all except that geometrical point, the I, bringing everything back to the sole atom, expanding everything in God, entangling all activity from summit to base in the obscurity of a dizzy mechanism, attaching the flight of an insect to the movement of the earth, subordinating, who knows? Were it only by the identity of the law, the evolution of the comet in the firmament to the whirling of the infusoria in the drop of water. A machine is made of mind, enormous gearing, the prime motor of which is the gnat, and whose final wheel is the zodiac. Chapter 4. Change of Gate. It seemed that this garden, created in olden days to conceal wanton mysteries, had been transformed and become fitted to shelter chaste mysteries. There were no longer either arbours, or bowling greens, or tunnels, or grottos. There was a magnificent dishevelled obscurity falling like a veil over all. Paphos had been made over into Eden. It is impossible to say what element of repentance had rendered this retreat wholesome. This flower girl now offered her blossom to the soul. This coquettish garden, formerly decidedly compromised, had returned to virginity and modesty. A justice assisted by a gardener, a good man who thought that he was a continuation of Lamoignon, and another good man who thought that he was a continuation of Le Nôtre, had turned it about, cut, ruffled, decked, moulded it to gallantry. Nature had taken possession of it once more, had filled it with shade, and had arranged it for love. There was also in this solitude a heart which was quite ready. Love had only to show himself. He had here a temple composed of verdure, grass, moss, the sight of birds, tender shadows, agitated branches, and a soul made of sweetness, of faith, of candour, of hope, of aspiration, and of illusion. Cosette had left the convent when she was still almost a child. She was a little more than 14, and she was at the ungrateful age. We have already said that with the exception of her eyes, she was homely rather than pretty. She had no ungraceful feature, but she was awkward, thin, timid, and bold at once. A grown-up little girl, in short. Her education was finished, that is to say, she had been taught religion, and even and above all, devotion, then history, that is to say, the thing that bears that name in convents, geography, grammar, the participles, the kings of France, a little music, a little drawing, etc. But in all other respects she was utterly ignorant, which is a great charm and a great peril. The soul of a young girl should not be left in the dark. Later on, mirages that are too abrupt and too lively are formed there, as in a dark chamber. She should be gently and discreetly enlightened, rather with the reflection of realities than with their harsh and direct light. A useful and graciously austere half-light which dissipates puerile fears and obviates falls. There is nothing but the maternal instinct, that admirable intuition composed of the memories of the Virgin and the experience of the woman, which knows how this half-light is to be created and of what it should consist. Nothing supplies the place of this instinct. All the nuns in the world are not worth as much as one mother in the formation of a young girl's soul. Cosette had had no mother. She had only had many mothers, in the plural. As for Jean Valjean, he was indeed all tenderness, all solicitude, but he was only an old man, and he knew nothing at all. Now, in this work of education, in this grave matter of preparing a woman for life, what science is required to combat that vast ignorance which is called innocence? Nothing prepares a young girl for passions like the convent. The convent turns the thought in the direction of the unknown. The heart, thus thrown back upon itself, works downward within itself, since it cannot overflow, and grows deep, since it cannot expand. Hence visions, suppositions, conjectures, outlines of romances, a desire for adventures, fantastic constructions, edifices built wholly in the inner obscurity of the mind, sombre and secret abodes where the passions immediately find a lodgment as soon as the open gate permits them to enter. The convent is a compression which, in order to triumph over the human heart, should last during the whole life. On quitting the convent, Cosette could have found nothing more sweet and more dangerous than the house in the Rue Plumet. It was the continuation of solitude with the beginning of liberty, a garden that was closed, but a nature that was acrid, rich, voluptuous, and fragrant. The same dreams as in the convent, but with glimpses of young men, a grating, but one that opened on the street. Still, when she arrived there, we repeat, she was only a child. Jean Valjean gave this neglected garden over to her. "Do what you like with it," he said. This amused Cosette. She turned over all the clumps and all the stones, she hunted for beasts, she played in it while awaiting the time when she would dream in it. She loved this garden for the insects that she found beneath her feet amid the grass, while awaiting the day when she would love it for the stars that she would see through the boughs above her head. And then she loved her father, that is to say, Jean Valjean, with all her soul, with an innocent filial passion which made the good man a beloved and charming companion to her. It will be remembered that M. Madeleine had been in the habit of reading a great deal. Jean Valjean had continued this practice. He had come to converse well. He possessed the secret riches and the eloquence of a true and humble mind which has spontaneously cultivated itself. He retained just enough sharpness to season his kindness. His mind was rough and his heart was soft. During their conversation in the Luxembourg, he gave her explanations of everything, drawing on what he had read, and also on what he had suffered. As she listened to him, Cosette's eyes wandered vaguely about. This simple man sufficed for Cosette's thoughts, the same as the wild garden sufficed for her eyes. When she had had a good chase after the butterflies, she came panting up to him and said, "Ah, how I have run!" He kissed her brow. Cosette adored the good man. She was always at his heels. Where Jean Valjean was, there happiness was. Jean Valjean lived neither in the pavilion nor the garden. She took greater pleasure in the paved back courtyard than in the enclosure filled with flowers, and in his little lodge furnished with straw-seated chairs, than in the great drawing-room hung with tapestry, against which stood tufted easy-chairs. Jean Valjean sometimes said to her, smiling at his happiness in being importuned, "Do go to your own quarters, leave me alone a while." She gave him those charming and tender scoldings which are so graceful when they come from a daughter to her father. "Father, I am very cold in your rooms. Why don't you have a carpet here and a stove?" "Dear child, there are so many people who are better than I, and who have not even a roof over their heads." "Then why is there a fire in my rooms, and everything that is needed?" "Because you are a woman and a child." "Bah! Must men be cold and feel uncomfortable?" "Certain men." "That is good. I shall come here so often that you will be obliged to have a fire." And again she said to him, "Father, why do you eat horrible bread like that?" "Because, my daughter." "Well, if you eat it, I will eat it too." Then, in order to prevent Cosette eating black bread, Jean Valjean ate white bread. Cosette had but a confused recollection of her childhood. She prayed morning and evening for the mother whom she had never known. The Thénardiers had remained with her as two hideous figures in a dream. She remembered that she had gone, one day at night, to fetch water in a forest. She thought that it had been very far from Paris. It seemed to her that she had begun to live in an abyss, and that it was Jean Valjean who had rescued her from it. Her childhood produced upon her the effect of a time when there had been nothing around her but millipedes, spiders, and serpents. When she meditated in the evening before falling asleep, as she had not a very clear idea that she was Jean Valjean's daughter, and that he was her father, she fancied that the soul of her mother had passed into that good man and had come to dwell near her. When he was seated, she leaned her cheek against his white hair and dropped a silent tear, saying to herself, "Perhaps this man is my mother." Cosette, although this is a strange statement to make in the profound ignorance of a girl brought up in a convent, maternity being also absolutely unintelligible to virginity, had ended by fancying that she had had as little mother as possible. She did not even know her mother's name. Whenever she asked Jean Valjean remained silent. If she repeated her question, he responded with a smile. Once she insisted, the smile ended in a tear. This silence on the part of Jean Valjean covered Fantine with darkness. Was it prudence? Was it respect? Was it a fear that he should deliver this name to the hazards of another memory than his own? So long as Cosette had been small, Jean Valjean had been willing to talk to her of her mother. When she became a young girl, it was impossible for him to do so. It seemed to him that he no longer dared. Was it because of Cosette? Was it because of Fantine? He felt a certain religious horror at letting that shadow enter Cosette's thought, and of placing a third in their destiny. The more sacred this shade was to him, the more did it seem that it was to be feared. He thought of Fantine, and felt himself overwhelmed with silence. Through the darkness he vaguely perceived something which appeared to have its finger on its lips. Had all the modesty which had been in Fantine, and which had violently quitted her during her lifetime, returned to rest upon her after her death, to watch in indignation over the peace of that dead woman, and in its shyness to keep her in her grave? Was Jean Valjean unconsciously submitting to the pressure? We who believe in death are not among the number who will reject this mysterious explanation. Hence the impossibility of uttering, even for Cosette, the name of Fantine. One day Cosette said to him, "Father, I saw my mother in a dream last night. She had two big wings. My mother must have been almost a saint during her life." "Through martyrdom," replied Jean Valjean. However, Jean Valjean was happy. When Cosette went out with him, she leaned on his arm, proud and happy, in the plenitude of her heart. Jean Valjean felt his heart melt within him with delight, at all these sparks of a tenderness so exclusive, so wholly satisfied with himself alone. The poor man trembled, inundated with angelic joy. He declared to himself ecstatically that this would last all their lives. He told himself that he really had not suffered sufficiently to merit so radiant a bliss, and he thanked God in the depths of his soul for having permitted him to be loved thus, he a wretch, by that innocent being. End of Book 3, Chapters 3 and 4.
Chapters 5 and 6 of Book 3 of Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo. Les Misérables, Volume 4 by Victor Hugo, translated by Isabel Florence Hapgood. Book 3, The House in the Rue Plumet. Chapter 5, The Rose Perceives that it is an Engine of War. One day, Cosette chanced to look at herself in her mirror, and she said to herself, "Really?" It seemed to her almost that she was pretty. This threw her in a singularly troubled state of mind. Up to that moment, she had never thought of her face. She saw herself in her mirror, but she did not look at herself. And then, she had so often been told that she was homely. Jean Valjean alone said gently, "No, indeed. No, indeed." At all events, Cosette had always thought herself homely, and had grown up in that belief with the easy resignation of childhood. And here, all at once, was her mirror saying to her, as Jean Valjean had said, "No, indeed." That night she did not sleep. What if I were pretty, she thought. How odd it would be if I were pretty. And she recalled those of her companions, whose beauty had produced a sensation in the convent, and she said to herself, "What? Am I to be like Mademoiselle so-and-so?" The next morning she looked at herself again, not by accident this time, and she was assailed with doubts. "Where did I get such an idea?" said she. "No, I am ugly." She had not slept well, that was all. Her eyes were sunken and she was pale. She had not felt very joyous on the preceding evening in the belief that she was beautiful, but it made her very sad not to be able to believe in it any longer. She did not look at herself again, and for more than a fortnight she tried to dress her hair with her back turned to the mirror. In the evening, after dinner, she generally embroidered in wool, or did some convent needlework in the drawing-room, and Jean Valjean read beside her. Once she raised her eyes from her work, and she was rendered quite uneasy by the manner in which her father was gazing at her. On another occasion, she was passing along the street, and it seemed to her that someone behind her, whom she did not see, said, "A pretty woman, but badly dressed." "Bah," she thought, "he does not mean me. I am well dressed and ugly." She was then wearing a plush hat and her merino gown. At last, one day when she was in the garden, she heard poor old Toussaint saying, "Do you notice how pretty Cosette is growing, sir?" Cosette did not hear her father's reply, but Toussaint's words caused a sort of commotion within her. She fled from the garden, ran up to her room, flew to the looking-glass. It was 3 months since she had looked at herself, and gave vent to a cry. She had just dazzled herself. She was beautiful and lovely. She could not help agreeing with Toussaint and her mirror. Her figure was formed, her skin had grown white, her hair was lustrous, an unaccustomed splendor had been lighted in her blue eyes. The consciousness of her beauty burst upon her in an instant, like the sudden advent of daylight. Other people noticed it also. Toussaint had said so. It was evidently she of whom the passer-by had spoken. There could no longer be any doubt of that. She descended to the garden again, thinking herself a queen, imagining that she heard the birds singing, though it was winter, seeing the sky gilded, the sun among the trees, flowers in the thickets, distracted, wild, in inexpressible delight. Jean Valjean, on his side, experienced a deep and undefinable oppression at heart. In fact, he had, for some time past, been contemplating with terror that beauty which seemed to grow more radiant every day on Cosette's sweet face. The dawn that was smiling for all was gloomy for him. Cosette had been beautiful for a tolerably long time before she became aware of it herself. But from the very first day, that unexpected light which was rising slowly and enveloping the whole of the young girl's person wounded Jean Valjean's somber eye. He felt that it was a change in a happy life, a life so happy that he did not dare to move for fear of disarranging something. This man, who had passed through all manner of distresses, who was still all bleeding from the bruises of fate, who had been almost wicked, and who had become almost a saint, who, after having dragged the chains of the galleys, was now dragging the invisible but heavy chain of indefinite misery. This man whom the law had not released from its grasp, and who could be seized at any moment and brought back from the obscurity of his virtue to the broad daylight of public opprobrium. This man accepted all, excused all, pardoned all, and merely asked of Providence, of man, of the law, of society, of nature, of the world, one thing, that Cosette might love him, that Cosette might continue to love him, that God would not prevent the heart of the child from coming to him and from remaining with him. Beloved by Cosette, he felt that he was healed, rested, appeased, loaded with benefits, recompensed, crowned. Beloved by Cosette, it was well with him. He asked nothing more. Had anyone said to him, "Do you want anything better?" he would have answered, "No." God might have said to him, "Do you desire heaven?" and he would have replied, "I should lose by it." Everything which could affect this situation, if only on the surface, made him shudder like the beginning of something new. He had never known very distinctly himself what the beauty of a woman means, but he understood instinctively that it was something terrible. He gazed with terror on this beauty, which was blossoming out ever more triumphant and superb beside him, beneath his very eyes, on the innocent and formidable brow of that child, from the depths of her homeliness, of his old age, of his misery, of his reprobation. He said to himself, "How beautiful she is! What is to become of me?" There, moreover, lay the difference between his tenderness and the tenderness of a mother. What he beheld with anguish, a mother would have gazed upon with joy. The first symptoms were not long in making their appearance. On the very morrow of the day on which she had said to herself, "Decidedly I am beautiful," Cosette began to pay attention to her toilet. She recalled the remark of that passer-by, pretty but badly dressed. The breath of an oracle, which had passed beside her and had vanished, after depositing in her heart one of the two gems which are destined, later on, to fill the whole life of woman, coquetry. Love is the other. With faith in her beauty, the whole feminine soul expanded within her. She conceived a horror for her merinos, and shame for her plush hat. Her father had never refused her anything. She had once acquired the whole science of the bonnet, the gown, the mantle, the boot, the cuff, the stuff which is in fashion, the color which is becoming, that science which makes of the Parisian woman something so charming, so deep, and so dangerous. The words heady woman were invented for the Parisienne. In less than a month, little Cosette, in the tabac of the Rue de Babylon, was not only one of the prettiest, but one of the best-dressed women in Paris, which means a great deal more. She would have liked to encounter her passer-by to see what he would say, and to teach him a lesson. The truth is that she was ravishing in every respect, and that she distinguished the difference between a bonnet from Giraud and one from Herbault in the most marvelous way. Jean Valjean watched these ravages with anxiety. He who felt that he could never do anything but crawl, walk at the most, beheld wings sprouting on Cosette. Moreover, from the mere inspection of Cosette's toilet, a woman would have recognized the fact that she had no mother. Certain little proprieties, certain special conventionalities were not observed by Cosette. A mother, for instance, would have told her that a young girl does not dress in damask. The first day that Cosette went out in her black damask gown and mantle and her white crepe bonnet, she took Jean Valjean's arm, gay, radiant, rosy, proud, dazzling. "Father," she said, "how do you like me in this guise?" Jean Valjean replied in a voice which resembled the bitter voice of an envious man, "Charming." He was the same as usual during their walk. On their return home, he asked Cosette, "Won't you put on the other gown and bonnet again? You know the ones I mean." This took place in Cosette's chamber. Cosette turned towards the wardrobe where her cast-off schoolgirl's clothes were hanging. "That disguise," said she. "Father, What do you want me to do with it? Oh no, the idea! I shall never put on those horrors again. With that machine on my head, I have the air of Madame Mad Dog." Jean Valjean heaved a deep sigh. From that moment forth, he noticed that Cosette, who had always heretofore asked to remain at home, saying, "Father, I enjoy myself more here with you," now was always asking to go out. In fact, what is the use of having a handsome face and a delicious costume if one does not display them? He also noticed that Cosette had no longer the same taste for the back garden. Now she preferred the garden, and did not dislike to promenade back and forth in front of the railed fence. Jean Valjean, who was shy, never set foot in the garden. He kept to his backyard, like a dog. Cosette, in gaining the knowledge that she was beautiful, lost the grace of ignoring it. An exquisite grace, for beauty enhanced by ingenuousness, is ineffable, and nothing is so adorable as a dazzling and innocent creature who walks along, holding in her hand the key to paradise, without being conscious of it. But what she had lost in an ingenuous grace, she gained in pensive and serious charm. Her whole person, permeated with the joy of youth, of innocence, and of beauty, breathed forth a splendid melancholy. It was at this epoch that Marius, after the lapse of 6 months, saw her once more at the Luxembourg. Chapter 6. The battle begun. Cosette in her shadow, like Marius in his, was all ready to take fire. Destiny, with its mysterious and fatal patience, slowly drew together these two beings, all charged and all languishing with the stormy electricity of passion, these two souls which were laden with love, as two clouds are laden with lightning, and which were bound to overflow and mingle in a look like the clouds in a flash of fire. The glance had been so much abused in love romances that it has finally fallen into disrepute. One hardly dares to say nowadays that two beings fell in love because they looked at each other. That is the way people do fall in love, nevertheless, and the only way. The rest is nothing, but the rest comes afterwards. Nothing is more real than these great shocks which two souls convey to each other by the exchange of that spark. At that particular hour, when Cosette unconsciously darted that glance which troubled Marius, Marius had no suspicion that he had also launched a look which disturbed Cosette. He caused her the same good and the same evil. She had been in the habit of seeing him for a long time, and she had scrutinized him as girls scrutinize and see, while looking elsewhere. Marius still considered Cosette ugly, when she had already begun to think Marius handsome. But as he paid no attention to her, the young man was nothing to her. Still, she could not refrain from saying to herself that he had beautiful hair, beautiful eyes, handsome teeth, a charming tone of voice when she heard him conversing with his comrades, that he held himself badly when he walked, if you like, but with a grace that was all his own, that he did not appear to be at all stupid, that his whole person was noble, gentle, simple, proud, and that, in short, though he seemed to be poor, yet his air was fine. On the day when their eyes met at last, and said to each other those first obscure and ineffable things which the glance lisps, Cosette did not immediately understand. She returned thoughtfully to the house in the Rue de l'Oie, where Jean Valjean, according to his custom, had come to spend 6 weeks. The next morning, on waking, she thought of that strange young man, so long indifferent and icy, who now seemed to pay attention to her, and it did not appear to her that his attention was the least in the world agreeable to her. She was, on the contrary, somewhat incensed at this handsome and disdainful individual. A substratum of war stirred within her. It struck her, and the idea caused her a wholly childish joy that she was going to take her revenge at last. Knowing that she was beautiful, she was thoroughly conscious, though in an indistinct fashion, that she possessed a weapon. Women play with their beauty as children do with a knife. They wound themselves. The reader will recall Marius's hesitations, his palpitations, his terrors. He remained on his bench and did not approach. This vexed Cosette. One day she said to Jean Valjean, "Father, let us stroll about a little in that direction." Seeing that Marius did not come to her, she went to him. In such cases, all women resemble Mahomet. And then, strange to say, the first symptom of true love in a young man is timidity. In a young girl, it is boldness. This is surprising, and yet nothing is more simple. It is the two sexes tending to approach each other and assuming each the other's qualities. That day, Cosette's glance drove Marius beside himself, and Marius's glance set Cosette to trembling. Marius went away confident, and Cosette uneasy. From that day forth, they adored each other. The first thing that Cosette felt was a confused and profound melancholy. It seemed to her that her soul had become black since the day before. She no longer recognized it. The whiteness of soul in young girls, which is composed of coldness and gaiety, resembles snow. It melts in love, which is its sun. Cosette did not know what love was. She had never heard the word uttered in its terrestrial sense. On the books of profane music which entered the convent, amour, love, was replaced by timbre, drum, or pandore. This created enigmas which exercised the imaginations of the big girls, such as, "Ah, how delightful is the drum," or "Pity it is not a pandore." But Cosette had left the convent too early to have occupied herself much with the drum. Therefore, she did not know what name to give to what she now felt. Is anyone the less ill because one does not know the name of one's malady? She loved with all the more passion because she loved ignorantly. She did not know whether it was a good thing or a bad thing, useful or dangerous, eternal or temporary, allowable or prohibited. She loved. She would have been greatly astonished had anyone said to her, "You do not sleep? But that is forbidden. You do not eat? Why, that is very bad. You have oppressions and palpitations of the heart? That must not be. You blush and turn pale when a certain being clad in black appears at the end of a certain green walk? But that is abominable." She would not have understood, and she would have replied, "What fault is there of mine in a matter in which I have no power and of which I know nothing?" It turned out that the love which presented itself was exactly suited to the state of her soul. It was a sort of admiration at a distance, a mute contemplation, the deification of a stranger. It was the apparition of youth to youth, the dream of nights become a reality, yet remaining a dream, the longed-for phantom realized and made flesh at last, but having as yet neither name, nor fault, nor spot, nor exigence, nor defect. In a word, the distant lover who lingered in the ideal, a chimera but with a form. Any nearer and more palpable meeting would have alarmed Cosette at this first stage, when she was still half immersed in the exaggerated mists of the cloister. She had all the fears of children and all the fears of nuns combined. The spirit of the convent, with which she had been permeated for the space of 5 years, was still in the process of slow evaporation from her person, and made everything tremble around her. In this situation he was not a lover. He was not even an admirer. He was a vision. She set herself to adoring Marius as something charming, luminous, and impossible. As extreme innocence borders on extreme coquetry, she smiled at him with all frankness. Every day she looked forward to the hour for their walk with impatience. She found Marius there, she felt herself unspeakably happy, and thought in all sincerity that she was expressing her whole thought when she said to Jean Valjean, "What a delicious garden the Luxembourg is." Marius and Cosette were in the dark as to one another. They did not address each other. They did not salute each other. They did not know each other. They saw each other, and, like the stars of heaven, which are separated by millions of leagues, they lived by gazing at each other. It was thus that Cosette gradually became a woman and developed, beautiful and loving, with a consciousness of her beauty and in ignorance of her love. She was a coquette to boot, through her ignorance. End of Book 3, Chapters 5 and 6.